Hi, Moments for the Master from Isaiah 57, the eternity of God. I have a story I want to tell you about the Sears Tower. But the text is Isaiah 57. The good book says, "Thus saith the high and lofty one that inhabiteth eternity, whose name is holy. I dwell in the high and holy place." The text tells of our mighty God and how our mighty God, the text tells us he inhabits eternity and that he dwelt in eternity in the ages and eons before creation, and that our great high and lofty God, who is one God, he will dwell in the eons to come. He is ageless and changeless. I want to tell you about this pastor who was preaching in Chicago. But our text also tells us that the high and lofty one, that our God is high and lofty and he is one and he dwells in eternity. The text also speaks of God dwelling in time. It's a concept that it's hard to grasp, that God can dwell in eternity and yet God can dwell. That text tells us he dwells in the humble and contrite spirit. He dwells in the humble heart. This pastor was preaching in Chicago, and he was preaching at a Bible conference at the Moody Bible Institute. Right outside the window of his room was the Great Sears Tower. Now, I don't know if it's still called the Sears Tower, but that building is a quarter of a mile straight up in the air. And the pastor told how he would look at that massive building. At that time, it was the largest building in the world. That great feat of architecture. I've been there a lot of times. And he would say, if you would take a nickel, he wrote that if you took a nickel and put that nickel on the street next to the Sears Tower, that Sears Tower would be like God, high and lofty and massive. And that nickel laying on the sidewalk next to it would be like man, just insignificant. But the thing that's hard to grasp and get a hold of about the text is that God dwells in the human heart. That God not only inhabits eternity, he will confine himself to my heart and live and dwell with me. God doesn't live in buildings. God doesn't live in church houses or synagogues. God lives with me, and he walks with me, and he talks with me. And I can see God work in my own humble circumstance. What a concept, that God is high and lofty, ageless, eternal, and yet he enters time and lives and dwells and walks with common people like me.